And thank you all for attending. My name is Stephen Luttrell. I'm an attorney with the law firm of Whiteford, Taylor, and Preston, working out of Baltimore, practicing in the area of environment and solar and renewable energy. Happy to be moderating this panel today, which includes representatives from Montgomery County Green Bank, specifically Steve Morrell, the Chief Investment Officer, and Rokas Barasinovas, the Commercial Business Director. Also joining us is Matt Coleman from Skyview Ventures. Skyview is a solar developer and construction contractor. I've had the pleasure of working with both of these groups and all three of these individuals on various solar projects. I'll turn it over to them to allow them to introduce themselves in greater detail and explain a little bit more about what they do. Thank you again all for joining us this afternoon, and we hope that it's enjoyable and productive experience for you. And Steve, we'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Steve. Much appreciated. I'm Steve Morrell. I'm the Chief Investment Officer with the Montgomery County Green Bank. Very happy to be here and appreciate doing this co-webinar with Skyview and with WTP. We've got a couple slides that I'll run through here, but really interested for a discussion with everybody that's listening on how to really promote solar and energy efficiency among common ownership communities. So I'll just go ahead and dive in here first. If we can go to the next slide. So who we are, the Montgomery County Green Bank. We're a kind of funny bank. We're not a bank in that we don't take deposits. We are more like an investment fund. We were chartered by Montgomery County back in 2016, but we're an independent 501c3 organization. The purpose of our organization is to accelerate investment in energy efficiency and renewable energy, and we do that by partnering with the private sector. All the money that we received when we were initially chartered by the county from the Pepco Exelon merger, we leverage with commercial entities. And so we work with equity investors, we work with other commercial lenders, we work with other funds, really to draw in more capital into this sector. And at the end of the day, we focus on a diverse, equitable, and inclusively prosperous focus on the county's climate goals related to resiliency, sustainability, and health. We can go to the next goal, the next slide. We wanted to talk about solar today, and that's really one of the main focuses, and we can talk about energy efficiency as well. But we do work with a lot of common ownership communities in Montgomery County, trying to think about how do I put solar up through either individual roofs or through an association roof, depending on how a community is organized, either through a condo association or an HOA. So we wanted to list a couple options here, really just to make your minds think about what's the best way to start getting solar on a common ownership community. And there's a couple different ways that you could do that. You can think about a solar array that's connected to a master meter. So if you're working with a property or you live in a property that's master metered and the residents pay the utilities through assessments, it's a fairly simple equation. The solar array can connect to that master meter and provide power from it. You can think about a solar array that's connected to and supports common areas only. So if instead the property, the common ownership community has individual meters, well, there's also going to be meters for the common areas. These are the commercial meters that an association may pay. And so you can think about a solar array that supports those meters. Thirdly, you can think about a solar array connected to the utility that supports community solar, and you can subscribe for virtual credits. So we can talk more about community solar, but it's a great option to net out a certain type of solar production on your bill if you're a participant or a subscriber in community solar. And so one nice thing for a common ownership community could think about hosting a community solar array and providing those benefits out to each of the residents within the community. So the last piece here is you can see what's missing if you thought about a solar array connected to individual meters. So that works if you're an individual house, but if you're in a common ownership community, you have to recall that roofs are typically common space. So it's very challenging, and we've never seen this done, where somebody can build a solar array just on their own individual, call it roof space, because those roofs are common space shared by and maintained by an association. So really the first three ways kind of get to how you can put solar up on a common ownership community. And then once you figure out what type of installation you're looking at, you can think about a couple different finance models and the pros and cons to get there. So if you're thinking about how do I get solar, there's really two big buckets of options. There's the upfront purchase or ownership option, and there's a third-party ownership option. So upfront purchase or ownership is pretty straightforward, as the name says. Somebody goes out and buys solar and puts it up on a premise, on a rooftop, for example, and then starts getting the benefits of the offset from solar power, the credit to what you're not purchasing from the utility. So that's pretty straightforward, but the third-party ownership model is actually one we see more often with common ownership communities, and that's the rent the roof model. That's where you work with a solar developer who owns the assets and essentially leases the space. If you're thinking about a rooftop system, leases your roof and owns the solar on top of your roof and sells you the power that's generated under it. That can happen through a power purchase agreement, that can happen through a lease, and that can happen with community solar, that option that I had mentioned up above previously. So there's certainly pros and cons to each. And if you think about what does an upfront purchase entail, it means exactly that you have to spend the capital in order to get that solar system. But once you have that capital, then you get all of the benefits that come from it. One of the challenges of that is that there are significant tax benefits out there for solar at the federal level, and a nonprofit entity doesn't qualify, or even a small business entity that doesn't have a big tax liability wouldn't qualify to get the tax benefit. So it's a real challenge if you think that up to 26% of the cost, which is what the investment tax credit is right now, could be left on the table. It makes a lot of common ownership communities think of the third-party ownership model instead. What the developer can do is, as a for-profit entity, take advantage of that tax benefit and inure the benefit down into the PPA price that's paid. We can go to the next slide. So we use the Green Bank, which I had introduced. Within Montgomery, we're a fund within Montgomery County dedicated to the county's climate goals. We do a lot of support for common ownership communities through a couple different ways. One is technical assistance. It's a challenge to always think about where a property needs by way of energy efficiency or renewables. And so we offer programs to get technical assistance for energy audits and educate, provide contractor referrals, and other types of project facilitation. So a property manager or property owners, if you think of a board that's really focused on these issues, can think about what the best opportunities are in this space. And then we have a series of financial products that can really help the common ownership communities deploy energy efficiency and renewables. We have what's called the CLEAR product out there, Commercial Loan for Energy Efficiency and Renewables, PPA finance product, which is helping support the third-party model that I was talking about, and a small business energy savings support. And I want to highlight that first in the third one. These are term loan products out there that are really dedicated towards flexibility. One of the challenges that a lot of commercial entities have, and particularly associations have, is that property is encumbered by typically other types of debt. If you think of a common ownership community where each of the residents has their own mortgages, and there are other liens out there or other financing that's been done to try and improve common areas or build out pool houses, et cetera. It's a challenge to think of new financing to support energy efficiency and renewables. But if you look at financing from more like an equipment financing standpoint, which is what we do with CLEAR and that small business program, you can get around some of those concerns. So these are partnerships that we have with commercial banks that are local to Montgomery County, where we can help deploy those types of solutions out to common ownership communities. Next slide. A couple of case studies that we have here, just wanted to highlight so you can get a flavor of what does this actually mean in action. This is a project that we financed to help do an LED lighting conversion. It was a small business loan, one of those products I was mentioning, that really provided the common ownership community the flexibility to engage in reducing their energy consumption through LED light conversions. I'm gonna go to the next slide. This was another recent case study that we did to help a community think about EV chargers. Again, a small business loan that we put out in conjunction with what's called a community development finance institution, City First Enterprises, in order to help them electrifying and get the infrastructure needed for 6 EV chargers. And if we go to the next slide, we have a short video. I'm going to jump off camera here as we switch to the video, and then I will come back on.
We had a lot of problems with our systems. Our boilers were bad. We were paying about 40% of our annual budget for our utility bills. I think the main concern that people had was we wanted to save money, both on maintenance of these old systems that were really going bad on us, as well as on our energy costs.
It's an older building, and they have a lot of infrastructure improvements, and a significant amount of those had to do with our mechanical equipment.
The core of the project was to replace their existing heating plant, and that could have been easily done by just replacing the existing boilers. But in their case, what we were able to also incorporate was a fairly unique and innovative combined heat and power system, where they're actually making their own electricity on site using natural gas, and then recovering all that waste heat in order to be able to heat the building and heat the showers and sinks for the residents.
The contractor really worked with us from the very beginning to define the scope of the project in a way that was going to meet our goals, what we wanted to achieve, what scope of the project we could afford.
When a property owner or a group of property owners approaches a contractor with aging infrastructure, the solution isn't always known. And so one of the biggest roles that the contractor's playing is identifying what that solution could be. And it's important, though, to identify that solution in conjunction with understanding the cost behind it. The Green Bank wants to see financial improvements in the properties that we're working with. We have a particular focus on common ownership communities. We can come up with a holistic picture, as we did with Tacoma Overlook.
In addition to that, because of the free funding that was able to create from grants and rebates and other structures, they were also able to upgrade thermostats in the residences, add EV chargers out front, and even improve some of their parking lot lighting for added security. There's the environmental aspect of their environmental impact here in the local community, which was important to them. We tried to help them to manage it from as much of a holistic environmental and financial perspective as possible. They're saving a substantial amount of money on their repair and operating costs each year, upwards of $80,000 to even $100,000 per year.
If it hadn't been for Green Bank, we wouldn't be in a better position now than we were.
Great, so thank you for that. And if we'll go to the next slide, we just really wanted to share that short video that we made after working with the Tacoma Overlook, really to help you think about some ideas as you're working with either properties that you're managing or as boards and residents of properties to think about what type of energy efficiency measures you may be interested in, how they resonate with the type of property conditions you have. If we jump to the next slide, that is it from us. Again, we just wanted to quickly run through some slides, and I look forward to your questions in terms of implementing solar. And thank you again for having me on the panel today.
All right. Steve, thank you so much for that. We do have a few questions to throw out to you here to elaborate further on some of the themes and some of the items you've hit. I think the first one is, and this one's going to be, I think, a little particular to solar, but to the extent that this analysis makes sense for any of the other products you offer, which is a better financial return for the common ownership community? Is it the outright purchase of solar panels, or would it be a third-party approach like a PPA?
Sure, no, that's a really good question. And I think it's a particularly good question because a lot of common ownership communities tell us that they really need to think not just about the financial return, but their ability to actually implement a project as well. There's other considerations like the fact that boards tend to be volunteer organizations. When you're thinking about long-term assets that have 20, 25 years or even longer operating life, is everybody who thought about it in the first place going to still be working with the organization over time? So the short answer is that you will always get a better financial return if you purchase an asset and then get the benefit from it. That's just kind of a mathematical reality of it. However, that means that you have to outlay the capital in order to make that purchase. And solar isn't necessarily cheap. If you're thinking of a 100 kW system or so, which is fairly average for some of the roofs that we have, you're thinking about spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on it. And those are reserves that could be spent elsewhere. And so I always say that if you have the ability to finance, that's one way to help mitigate that situation where you're spending the reserves and can focus those reserves on other things. Or if you can move to the third-party model completely, then you have no upfront capital that you're putting towards something. You're just paying for the power that's being generated. So another way to think about that is that you're actually sharing the power, or you're sharing the savings benefit with the developer who owns the system. So certainly your returns are diminished, but again, you didn't have to put out any capital to get there. In addition, you have a developer who's now owning, maintaining, replacing parts, and really making sure that the system works well. And that's a good thing for nonprofits and common ownership communities in particular, because to think about all the effort that you would have to put in otherwise to maintaining a system, replacing parts when they break, it's really helpful to have that third-party group on there. So you really have to evaluate both the financial return as well as the capacity of the organization to think, how much can I actually put in my time and effort to manage that?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so yeah, certainly those maintenance obligations and risks for the project being on a third party are certainly one reason to think about going with the third-party PPA. A related question, you touched on this a little bit, but if you could expand a little bit more. You know, the whole concept of the certain rebates and tax incentives and tax credits, and why common ownership communities would be excluded from being able to take advantage of those.
Yeah, it's a good question, because you're talking about a big chunk of the project cost to be able to implement that. So the biggest one is a federal tax credit that's out there. Right now it's at 26%. It used to be 30%, and maybe it'll go back up there, but right now it's 26%. And it acts as a tax credit. And if you don't have a large tax liability, or if you're a nonprofit that's not paying taxes at all, you don't have an ability actually to take in that credit. And so at the end of the day, if you tally up your taxes and you don't have an ability to take it, you're leaving that on the table. And so the federal tax credit of 26% is really important. There are other incentives out there that are available to anybody who wants them, whether they're a nonprofit or not. There's utility incentives. There are MEA, Maryland Energy Association grants associated with certain solar projects. And that is all quote unquote free money out there that's really dedicated towards solar, and it's important. So as soon as you start working with a developer or an installer or an energy performance contractor, they're usually pretty familiar with how to access those benefits. And that was one of the keys in the video that we were sharing there, is that there was a lot of utility incentives to the projects that they were doing, bringing down the cost, making the financing be more reasonable to what they were looking to do. So it's a challenge, and certainly some people do leave the tax credit on the table. Even though they're a nonprofit, they still, for various reasons, want to purchase solar as opposed to use the third-party model. But the third-party model at least brings in those benefits, and the benefit can then flow down into what the PPA price is that somebody's paying.
All right, thank you, that makes sense. Maybe a more fundamental question here. How would someone get started on one of these projects? Do they come to you? Is it a situation where a contractor comes to them? Do they solicit bids? In your experience, how do you normally see these projects get off the ground, or what is the genesis for them?
Yeah, great question. I definitely do tell people, think Green Bank when you think about these projects, and feel free to reach out anytime. One of the things that we do, as I mentioned at the beginning, was we do work on education and figuring out what the needs of common ownership communities are, and then pairing them up with the right energy performance contractors or solar installers. So we're not the technical experts ourselves, we're finance folks. And so we want to make sure to make that pairing in with the technical expert, the engineers, the professional engineers, or the installers out there that can really figure out what is the capacity of a solar system that you could get, what type of HVAC upgrade could you do. They really have the idea of what are the physical measures that could be done. And so that's really kind of key step number one, is to get paired up with them, go under that investigative effort to really figure out what you can actually get. And then you can really figure out what the financing model behind it should be. And we help with that as well. So step number one is always to reach out to us. Go to mcgreenbank.org, and you can find all of our contact information. You can find some pamphlets actually that have some more information about what we described, and really see what are the best ways to proceed for steps forward. The last thing I'll say is that if instead you get immediately in contact with say a solar installer who you started talking with, or a contractor or a developer even, that's a good step too. You know, you don't necessarily need to come to the Green Bank first. We always like to help with that effort, but certainly there are people out there that can provide you with proposals. And a lot of common ownership communities are at varying degrees of, I call it the education process. Some are just saying, hey, we know we want solar, but we don't know what to do. Others have the engineering or the capacity specifications in mind, and they can jump right to getting proposals and getting cost bids, and then we can help with financing as well. So there's a degree of who you can contact within there depending on how much you know, and certainly the Green Bank can help first with some educational elements.
Okay, and then last question, I think, before we'll turn it over to Matt Coleman to talk more specifically about solar projects, and this one will probably be easy for you, is that is the Green Bank available to come present to various organizations to talk in more depth about the products that you offer and the services that you can link them up with?
Yeah, no, appreciate that, because indeed the simple answer is yes. And we're really pleased to do that. And we do it in a couple different fronts. Sometimes we do general presentations that just talk about what we're talking about today and dive into maybe a specific topic and our financial products more specifically. And then sometimes we do very specific presentations where you already have a proposal, you already have a contractor you're working with, and then you're trying to figure out, well, what does this mean? How do I actually implement a financial strategy in relation to the type of reserves that we have and the type of financing that we have elsewhere. So we can really go from broad to specific, and we're pleased to do any of those kinds of presentations. Again, feel free to reach out. I know that we're going to pass along all our contact information and these slides on the website. There's easy contact information as well, and we're pleased at any point to do any presentation.
All right. Well, thank you. I think that's that's all the questions we have, I think, for you at the moment. But if you have other questions from Montgomery County Green Bank that come up later in the presentation, please feel free to add those in the question function, and we'll get to those as much as time allows. And with that, we'll turn it over now to Matt Coleman of Skyview Ventures, and he's going to talk a little bit more about their solar development process. Thanks, Matt. It's all yours.
Thanks, Steve. Hello, everyone. I'm Matt Coleman from Skyview Ventures. Skyview is a firm where we develop, own, and operate solar power projects, as well as a number of other types of renewable energy investments. If you go to the next slide. So solar power is very much a key to what we do, and we develop some of our own solar projects through a company called Davis Hill Development. We also provide financial solutions for folks who want to own their own solar projects but need help understanding and having more security around some of the incentives. And one of those in Maryland is called an SREC, a Solar Renewable Energy Credit. And this is an incentive that you get for every kilowatt hour of electricity that's produced from a solar power system, but it is a market-based price, meaning it fluctuates every year based on supply and demand and some of the compliance requirements set in place by the state of Maryland. And so we help provide some financial hedges for folks who want to own their own solar system but don't want to bother with the SRECs and worrying about what those prices are going to be every year. And then a product of doing all this commercial solar power work is we've gotten a lot of requests, especially recently, for electric vehicle charging stations. Unfortunately, solar projects don't make sense everywhere. Every roof there could be roof issues, there could be site issues, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But the reality is, we are seeing a very strong trend in the electrification of vehicles, which is very exciting from our perspective. So yeah, we are now offering just electric vehicle infrastructure installations for folks through a company which we call Sky Chargers. Next slide, please. So this is just a portfolio of our solar projects. Most of what we do is in the East Coast. I know those purple circles are a little hard to tell, but yeah, we have a lot of concentration up and down I-95 between Washington, D.C. and Boston. And then we, working with, real estate companies and other corporate owners, we do solar projects wherever our customers want, really. But you can see here on the right too, we have a large concentration of projects here in the Washington, D.C. area and in Maryland. And what this does is gives us a nice view on understanding all different types of buildings, all different types of customers, and what it really costs to install solar power on different sites. Because the costs of solar power have come down a lot over the last 10 years, which is awesome. And it's made solar a lot more accessible to a lot more different types of building owners. But there's still challenges with different building types, and some buildings are easier and cheaper to install versus others. And so it's good that we do have this concentration of installations in the area and can really understand what it costs to install in different building types. Next slide. And again, just quick plug for EV charging. EV charging, there's various ways to install charging infrastructure on your properties. And certainly it's going to be something that we're going to see more and more of as more of us get electric vehicles. Thankfully, there are some incentives in the state of Maryland, and hopefully we'll see more of that. But again, looking at these options, it's also a process and understanding what's the best place to install these charging stations. Where do I have to trench underground to get from the charging station back to my electric service panel, or where I have to get the electricity for the charging station. So there are some considerations that you need to think about when planning electric vehicle charging stations. What type of software you want to use to help manage your charging station, and how you're going to, potentially price selling the electricity to your tenants or guests or other visitors when they're charging their vehicles. So it's a really interesting time, with the electric vehicle charging. But yeah, there are certainly some considerations each time you decide to add a charging station to your property. Next slide, please. Yeah, for solar, there's three main types of installations. Ground mount installations, which are not going to be too common around here because our real estate is worth so much. But if there is a piece of your property which you may not have plans for right away, maybe you've got plans for it in 10 or 20 years, then you would consider looking at a ground mount solar option where you can fence it in, take advantage of all the sun shining on that piece of ground you may not be using, and generate some solar electricity. Again, not too common around here, but certainly if you've got that land which is not being really utilized, it's something to consider. And it's certainly a visible installation, meaning everyone sees that there's solar panels there. You're definitely showing your commitment to sustainability or whatever sort of message you're trying to deliver to your community. Rooftop installations are certainly the most common around here, generally the cheapest to install, but you do need to consider the age of your roof and the condition of your roof, because once you put solar panels on your roof, you really don't want to take them off for the next 20 years. So you really want to make sure your roof is relatively new, good condition, and you're going to be okay leaving those solar panels on your roof for a long time. Now, you can remove solar panels to access the roof during, after they're installed to repair or patch or otherwise maintain your roof. That is certainly an option, but there's always added costs for those kind of efforts, for having, you have to turn off your system, the solar system, remove the equipment, address the roof issue, and then kind of reinstall everything. So it can be done, and certainly it happens all the time, but just the most important thing is really evaluating your roofs and their age and their condition, and making sure that you would expect them to last another 15 to 20 years. A parking lot installation, is unfortunately the most expensive option. Takes a lot of steel to raise those solar modules, usually 10 to 14 feet above the surface of a parking lot. But it's also just, again, a great statement to show solar panel commitment to your tenants or community. They do provide obviously shade, which is great in summertime, and cover in the fall and spring for when it's rain and it's snowy in the winter. So it does have added benefits besides just creating clean electricity. And again, if you're considering electric vehicle charging, it's really easy just to plug in a couple charging stations when you go ahead and do the work for a parking lot solar installation. Next slide. This is kind of just a very simple process that you would kind of go through when considering looking at different solar power projects. One thing to look at is really understanding how much electricity you use. And you're going to have different meters, or you might have different meters, as Steve was talking about. And so understanding the load on each of those meters and how much electricity you can really offset on each of those meters. Electric tariffs, unfortunately, are always a little complicated in understanding what on your electric bill you can really offset with solar electricity. The reality is there's going to be charges on your electric bill which solar electricity won't be able to reduce. But fortunately, most electric tariffs in Maryland, solar is pretty good at reducing most of it, volumetric or kilowatt hour charges. So that's one of the first things you want to do, is just understand how much electricity you can offset and what is the cost for electricity. And usually, someone like myself who develops on an operate project, we can help you with that. Any kind of local EPC or installer, or certainly the Green Bank can help with that. Or some of you might work with energy advisors who can help with that kind of analysis. In terms of evaluating your property, just for various options, again, that's usually an installer or an EPC firm who can walk your site with you, look at your roof conditions, take a look at the parking lot, and really evaluate what are your options for putting solar on your property. Structural engineering, fortunately, most buildings in this area are designed with sufficient loading capacities to handle the additional weight of solar panels on their roof. But certainly before any solar project commences, a structural engineer would do those calculations to confirm that your building can support solar equipment. Once you kind of figure out what kind of project you want, and moving forward, there's always two kind of general approvals that you'll need. One is to interconnect the project with the utility. For Pepco, for example, Pepco will look at the local distribution lines around your building, equipment, and just confirm that adding the solar equipment to your building won't impact their management of the electric infrastructure. And thankfully, most of these projects, the sizes that we'll be talking about, 1, 2, 300 kilowatts, usually those are okay with Pepco, and there's no significant upgrades. Now, the issue is if you're looking at doing community solar and really sending most of the electricity to the grid, then usually Pepco will add some safety features or maybe some communication features to the tab and add those extra costs. But Pepco's getting much better about being transparent about what those are and understanding what those might be when you're figuring out and underwriting a project. And then, of course, with any kind of project like this, there's always local building and electrical permits that you'll need to get as part of any project. And all that kind of feeds into the economics and figure out, how much is going to cost to install, how much is going to cost to interconnect with Pepco, how much electricity is going to be produced from the systems, and hopefully by then you'll understand the value of electricity, and someone like Skyview or the Green Bank can help you understand what the value of those SRECs are going to be as well. Next slide. Two kind of key contracts that you may enter if you're working with somebody like Skyview. One would be a power purchase agreement where you're purchasing the electricity from the solar system, and the other one would be a site lease. A site lease would be if we're doing a community solar project, which means the electricity is going out to the grid, and we're really just renting space on your building, on your property to put that solar equipment. Just a couple key contract terms of these. One, and the probably most important one, is we pay for everything, right? The idea is it's zero out of pocket for you up front and ongoing. You're just either saving money on your electric bill, benefiting from having solar electricity on site, or just from the annual rent payment that we'll be making as part of the contract. But yeah, the idea is that these projects are supposed to benefit you and not cost you money. If we do a PPA, though, you will have to agree to purchase all the electricity from the solar power system, which, again, this comes down to making sure you understand how much electricity you use on site and that the solar equipment is not going to necessarily produce more than what you use. So you make sure that you can really benefit from what you're paying for. And all we ask in return is you let the sunlight hit the solar power equipment and we get to make electricity from it. So hopefully that's not asking too much, but yeah, it's just important. Let the sun shine, hit the solar power equipment, and let us make electricity. Like I talked about earlier, the contract will address the cases where if you do need to repair or replace your roof, the contract will address that scenario, which means someone's got to pay for it. And also, you kind of have the right to change your mind at any time. But recognizing, like Steve was saying earlier, this is a capital investment. And so if someone like myself is making that capital investment based on a 20-year, say, contract term and a 20-year return, if you want to terminate the agreement early, that's fine, but there's usually early termination provisions. And then at the end of the contract, there's usually three options. You can either tell us to take the equipment off and restore the site to how it was before. If things are going well and the roof's in good condition or the site's in good condition, we can just extend the contract. Or if you really want to own the project at some point, like Steve was saying, if you can't take advantage of the tax credits today, but in the future you do want to own your equipment, there's always options for you to buy the project at some point during the contract term or at the end of the term. And that's, I think that's all I got.
All right, thank you, Matt. We've got a couple of questions for you. To start off with, when you're meeting with a customer, a host site, from your point of view, what should they have ready in order to have a productive discussion? What questions should they ask themselves? What should they have organized when they're first sitting down with someone like Skyview?
Good. So I think, like I said from a couple slides ago, yeah, you really want to understand, how much solar electricity we could be considering. So you should have access to your electric bills and have a sense of how much electricity from a solar system you could use. That's certainly not a requirement because there is always that option for community solar, but it's always great to be able to use the electricity on site from the solar equipment. You should have a good understanding of your buildings, right? If we're talking about potentially rooftop solar systems, it's very helpful to know, right away, how old are your roofs, right? Are they still under warranty? Do you have in your capital budgeting, plans to spend a lot of money on your roof in the next 5 to 10 years, right? Because that's going to help frame the discussion about where it makes sense to look at those projects. It's also helpful to understand your decision-making process, right? And understanding, what stakeholders you're going to have to get involved during the process. So as you're going through it, you can make sure that the right education is going on and the right folks are being brought into those discussions.
On the practical side, how much disruption could a host site expect if you were doing either an EV station or a roof-mounted solar project? What's the timeline for development in we'll call it typical construction scenario? And then after
Yeah.
that, what kind of disruption or interaction would you expect for the long-term maintenance? Not any kind of major capital repairs, but just ongoing maintenance.
Yeah, thankfully, most of the work for these types of projects are kind of done behind the scenes. In terms of developing both EV charging or solar, a lot of the design engineering work, a lot of the planning for permitting and interconnection, no disruption on site at all, right? You'll have some contractors walking around your facility a few times, maybe climbing up on the roof a few times, but not really impactful. The actual installation time frame, or you got guys with some power tools, power hand tools, and if we're talking EV charging, you've got some trenching and some concrete pads being poured, things like that. It's for EV charging, it's very fast. Days to depending how many EV charging stations we're talking about, it's days to at most weeks, but not mostly just days. And then commercial solar or solar on rooftops, usually you're talking 30 to 60 days for a typical installation, where you actually have people doing the work on site. Like I said, you'll hear some power tools, hand tools, but thankfully that's it. These are pretty, with the racking systems we use nowadays and the experience of the installers, these systems are installed pretty quickly. The only other disruption you want to mention for some solar projects is at some point you do need to tie in the solar system into your electrical panel, and that will mean you'll need to shut down electricity for whatever building it's being tied into. And that process can take anywhere from 30 minutes to a couple hours, depending upon the building. But usually that can be scheduled at a time when it's most convenient for folks.
You mentioned a little bit of solar vocab there that I'm gonna ask you, I think, for the benefit of our attendees to explain a little bit, and that is this concept of interconnection. And if you could, and I'll touch on this a little bit on my end, but so when you have to tie into the electrical grid, that's called the interconnection, and part of that process also involves the host site or the landlord. And if you could just give a brief overview of what their interaction is with that as far as signing permits or being involved in the permitting process, just so they have an understanding of what it is.
Yeah, exactly. So specifically for interconnection, which is exactly right. So it's connecting to the let's say Pepco utilities grid, and rightfully so. The utility is very careful about who plugs in what to their grid. So there is a application process and an engineering review. Folks like myself, we can prepare all those applications for a building owner, but it always does require the building owner's signature on those types of agreements, which obviously you want to make sure that they're on top of everything that's being done and proposed for their buildings. But those applications are submitted to the utility, and it can take anywhere from say 45 to probably 90 to 120 days sometimes for the utility to review those and perform any sort of studies on the electrical grid and the building to ensure that it's going to be a safe installation. And it's during that process that they'll identify any potential upgrades which are required, say like a new transformer, to provide a safe installation.
Got it. All right. Well, I think that's all the questions we have on your end. With that, I think that leaves me up to handle a few legal issues to close out the formal presentation, and then we'll open it back up for questions, which we'd love to get from the audience. Okay. As mentioned already, I'm Stephen Luttrell. I'm actually counsel at Whiteford Taylor Preston, not partner, but I'm the head of our clean and renewable energy group. We represent both. Actually, could you go to the next slide? Thank you. We represent both clean and renewable energy developers, folks like Skyview or like the Green Energy Bank, but we also represent landlords and host sites as well. So folks who might be looking at bringing in a solar project into their facility or hosting one on their rooftop. And I think that gives us some pretty valuable insights into what the concerns are on both ends of the development cycle. So when representing landlords and common ownership communities or commercial industrial communities or commercial industrial sites who want to bring solar on or want to undertake other green projects, we have an understanding of what the developer's side is going to be, what requirements they're going to have, which allows us to leverage those insights for your benefit, but also leads to a much smoother process for coming to a final agreement. If you go to the next slide. So I thought what I would do for the most part here is just talk very briefly about what we see as the benefits to the host sites and for things for host sites to consider, primarily as common ownership communities for solar projects. And the big thing that has been touched on, I think, pretty well by the Green Bank and also by Matt, is that the roof for a common ownership community is essentially an asset that doesn't really have a lot of competition for monetizing, meaning that your options for turning that roof into something other than a liability and a maintenance obligation, for the most part, are going to be limited to solar. So that means that scaling what you think is the benefit is mostly looking at that as an ability to cut down on your power costs to make your carrying costs for your community lower, which then benefits all of your residents. And you're looking to get that power cost as low as possible. In some contexts, you can get that at no cost. In some contexts, it's going to be at a pretty significant reduction on what you're paying the local utility. The things that you're going to need to think about before you get into this are, what approvals are you going to need in order to enter into the contract? I would say that in our experience, probably the biggest hurdles that we see on the project host site or on the landlord site is having the interest in the project get a little bit ahead of where the approvals are to enter into an agreement. Ultimately, you're going to go into a site lease and a power purchase agreement that Matt touched on, and you'll need to have the delegated authority from your association governing body to enter into that agreement. So you want to make sure you've got that lined up ahead of time, that you've had the opportunity for everybody to understand the project, to be able to weigh in on it, and so that when you go for approval, whether you need a full board, whether you need a board vote, or if it's an instance where you need to get approval from the full council of co-owners, that you've laid the groundwork for that so that it's a smooth process and you don't have holdups or approvals at the end that wind up coming as a surprise to you that could delay the start of your process. There are tax incentives that finance a lot of these projects, and those are normally those have expiration dates. So if you're building in delays on the front end, that may impact the pricing that's available to you, depending on when the project's placed in service. Could you go to the next slide? Okay. So just wanted to run through again some other considerations here. One thing you want to look at is, are there any liens or encumbrances on your property that you would need to have cleared? And the reason that that's important is that most of the projects, whether they're EV charging stations or they're rooftop solar projects, those are going to be developed in connection with either some kind of lender or tax equity investor on the part of the developer. And when the developer is putting together the package to fund their project, their lender or their investor is going to review whether or not there are any liens or encumbrances on your property that could represent a security lien on the project that they're funding. So they want to make sure that there's no competing security interests on the assets that's going to be developed. So it's good to know what those are in advance. Otherwise, you might wind up in a situation where the solar developer or EV project charging station is going to come back to you and say, well, look, it looks like you've got a lien on your property for an unpaid water bill. That's going to take time for you to clean up, and it may, again, delay the start of the process. The second thing that I would recommend is find a committee with the experience to evaluate what the offers are that are coming to you. You want to have folks that understand, if possible, the engineering, financial, and practical end of what the project is, so that they can ask the right questions and that you can tell your other professionals, most notably your lawyers or your accountants, what you're hoping to get out of the project. And that's a bit unwieldy if you have everybody involved in it and your association board might not have the requisite experience on its own, just based on the makeup of the board at that time, to tackle that. So it's worth reaching out to the rest of your community to identify folks that could weigh in on that. The next thing you want to do is make sure that you understand how the design may impact the practical and ongoing maintenance at your facility. one of the big questions is, where are the HVAC systems? And, are those HVAC systems owned individually by unit owners under their own separate maintenance contracts? For instance, you might have individual air conditioning units on your roof, and access to those is going to be important. And you want to make sure that the solar project doesn't, impede that access. But you also want to make, there might be other instances where, you might have independent service contracts, and you'll need to give notice to the contractors that, there will be work on the roof for the development of the solar project. The other thing that you'll want to ask is, although the development timeline is short, the developer might have a need for parking and laydown areas. And this is of a particular concern in more congested areas in Montgomery County, where your community might have very limited parking. It might have assigned parking. So you'll need to have some mechanism to work out where they're going to park their vehicles and where they're going to lay down equipment. That equipment could be the steel beams as racking systems, the panels themselves. I've certainly seen instances where a solar developer was required to pay for, was required to find and locate and facilitate substitute parking for a short period of time, so that assigned parking spots that were needed for laydown areas had an alternative in the neighborhood to park their cars for a week, 2 weeks as the project was done. And you'll need to think about coordinating those needs up front, but also you want to be able to represent to the developer what those needs are, so that as you're negotiating a lease, that you've built those in and it's not something that comes up after you've theoretically already come to an agreement. Next slide, please. Okay. And then, eventually you can have a lot of these conversations in the beginning with just the green bank or with the developer without having to involve a lawyer or beginning to incur a lot of legal fees. But at a certain point, you do want to have whoever your representatives are get involved in the process, because you will be entering into contracts that have a pretty long term. For the most part, solar projects last for a term of at least 20 years. That's normally the term for lenders or investors in these projects to recoup their investment. And sometimes you'll see it 20 years plus 1 to 2 5-year renewal periods. So certainly a long period lease. So once you start talking about a letter of intent, you'll want to get your lawyer involved and other advisors, financial or accountants. There's not always a letter of intent. So the moment you start talking about lease terms, I think that's where you want to involve us. Some key things to consider is what is the rent payment structure? As Matt alluded to, rent is normally in one of two forms. It can either be an exchange of power for the right to use the rooftop or the car park, or it could be in the form of a low monetary payment, but based on the value of solar projects and solar projects incentives, that tends to be a pretty low amount, and often the best value to the host site is getting a reduced payment. Other things to think about are what are your obligations? If you and those are going to vary by site. You really want to have a good understanding of kind of the physical layout of your site. And what I mean by that is, if you have a condo building that, let's say, just has a flat roof with no access, you don't really need to worry about security for the site, or how you'll keep guests away from the site because nobody's up on an A-frame roof. If, however, you are putting solar panels up on a site where, let's say, there's a rooftop pool or some kind of sun deck, and the solar panel is going to be on a separate fenced-off area, you need to ask yourself questions like, what is the security for that? Is there going to be a fence installed? Who's responsible for making sure that area is secured? And those are discussions you want to have with the developer. Other questions you might want to ask is, how long does the developer think it's going to take for them to get their approvals? Matt had mentioned the interconnection agreement. That's something that can take 90 to 120 days. There are also electrical and building permits that might be required. In some instances, you might need site planning or land use approvals. A lot of those are going to be out of the control of the developer, because they're going to be, permits and approvals granted by either the utility or the regulatory body. But you do want to put some kind of cap on that as to how long it's going to take. Part of that is just to incentivize getting the project up and running, so you can begin to see a return on your time in entering into the agreement. And I think part of that is also to make sure that, if the developer can't work out the technical issues and can't get the project running, that there is essentially a drop dead date where you'll have the opportunity to look for somebody else. So typically what I see in that that time period is almost up to a year to allow for various delays and delays that are beyond the control of the developer to give them a little flexibility. Getting into some other issues you might want to think about. In most instances, a common ownership community is going to have some mortgage with a lender like Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, who's going to want to have a subordination and non-disturbance agreement, or you might be asked to get estoppels from the mortgage lender, and those also take time to negotiate. So understanding upfront what financing instruments you also have attached to the building are important. Those take time and can delay coming to a final agreement. Other things to consider are, what are the maintenance obligations of the developer? You want to make sure that they're there and they've entered into a contract with somebody to maintain the project, so that that the regular maintenance is being performed on it, so that its production maintains what it should be, so that you're getting the economic benefit of it. And those are things like dusting off the panels, checking wiring connections. There are standard contracts developers should enter into in order to do that, because the one thing you want to make sure is that the production stays up, and that you're recouping your investment and your time and entering into it. Another thing to consider is often project developers will bundle and sell their projects to other investors. So you want to look at their ability to assign the project. The one thing that you want to make sure is that if the project is assigned to another developer, that developer is on the same technical and financial footing as the one you entered into the agreement with, so that you're, again, dealing with a reputable installer and someone that's going to stand behind the project. Another thing to think about is, what are the damages if the project fails? If your roof, if there's an issue with your roof, or it's got to come down, or you default on some obligation, what damages are you liable for to the developer? Sometimes those can be quite large in relation to what you think you're getting involved with. For instance, you might be required to pay damages for lost tax incentives. A lot of these projects are funded through an investment tax credit. So if you default on the project, you might be liable for a tax credit recapture. That's something that your lawyer will talk to you about. We're happy to talk to you about to make sure you're clear on what your exposure is. And then the last thing is, at the end of the project, which could be quite some time from now, does the developer have a clear responsibility for decommissioning the project, which means taking it off of your roof? You want to make sure that at the end of this project, that if it's time for the solar project to go, that you're not absorbing any of the costs in dewiring the project, removing the steel, and returning your roof to its prior condition. So I know that seems like a lot, but these are all pretty standard contract provisions that you can work out pretty easily with a reputable installer like Skyview. It tends to be a pretty short time frame to get these negotiated. I would say most of them take from the start of getting a contract over to your side to review, to having a final agreement, and a developer ready to start work on the project, is probably 3 to 4 weeks. Maybe a little bit longer, but certainly within, I would say, 1 or 2 development cycle, or 1 or 2 meeting cycles for a common ownership community, and that would be, I would say, pretty standard across the board. Next slide. All right, and that is the end of my side of the presentation. I see a few more questions have come in. One that I think we want to revisit potentially is this whole issue of tax credits and why nonprofit communities are excluded from those. I'll ask Steve to rejoin us on that one, and maybe he and I can talk a little bit more about that together. But the main reason why those tax credits are not available is that essentially there's no return for the common ownership community to take advantage of them. You need to have a tax liability in order to take advantage of the tax credit, and that also is true for the accelerated depreciation you can also use for the project as well. So normally, common ownership communities, nonprofits, and others don't find themselves in a position to be able to claim those. So that's the very bottom line answer to it, and I'll let Steve expand a little bit more on that if I've missed anything.
Yeah, I think that's right, Steve, and that's definitely the issue that any nonprofit is going to come across right now, and even for-profit entities that really have a small tax liability, that you just wouldn't really have the tax obligation to be able to provide for that benefit. So there are different types of credits in the eyes of the IRS. And so there are those that can provide a refund to you, and that's not what this is. There are those that can be moved on to further years as well. Again, that's not what this is. So it's a real challenge to think, how do you get enough tax liability to take advantage of this right away? Fortunately, there is legislation being considered right now at the federal level to turn that into actual refund money that can come up front. So it wouldn't be a credit that only somebody with a larger tax liability could take advantage of it, that it could be available to nonprofits. So that's legislation that's out there. Maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. I don't really unfortunately have insight on where that's going to go. But right now it is just limited to those with a tax liability.
Yeah, and the one thing I'll add to that is that we've talked a lot about common ownership communities, but in terms of other nonprofits and religious organizations, a somewhat related question is that I think again, you'll have to consult with your individual accountant and attorney, but I think if you are a faith-based organization that if you have a ground-mounted solar project that's paying you direct rental payments, those would be considered passive income that is allowed for you to take and still keep your faith-based nonprofit status. So, a couple of interesting questions around that issue of what payments you can accept and what tax incentives and rebates you're eligible for. There may also be some state rebates that common ownership communities are eligible for, rebates on the cost of it, but for anything tax related, for the most part, you're going to be excluded from unless you're a for-profit or tax-paying entity. Okay, if we still haven't touched on that enough, I would, and you've got questions about that, please feel free to contact myself or Steve Morrell or Rokas at Green Blank, and we'll be happy to talk to you about it more. Question for Matt is, what's the current price range for an EV charging station? If you could ballpark that one for the geography of Montgomery County, Maryland.
Ballpark that. So it's going to be anywhere this is a level 2 charger. There's level 1 chargers, which you can basically plug into any outlet. Level 2 is a little higher voltage, means you can charge a vehicle, within a few hours. So the cost of the equipment itself typically only runs, let's say $1,500 to $2,500, depending upon options. There's also single plug versus dual plug chargers. Usually dual plug is more cost-effective options where you get 2 ports on one charger and you can put them in between 2 parking spots. But then the real cost is just the actual installation part. We're talking about trenching, right? Getting the path for the conduit to run underground from the charging station to a building. That can run from a few $100s to thousands of dollars, depending how far you're going. And then the labor itself to install can be, again, depending how easy it is, it can be $1,000 up to a few $1,000s. So you're really all in talking about, on the low end, maybe $3,000 up through probably $10,000 or $15,000 on the high end.
Just as a follow-up question, Matt, do you see any trends in that one way or the other? Is that like, do you think that that's going to follow the price ranges for electric vehicles themselves coming down, or do you think that those costs are going to stay pretty steady? Have you seen any trends just in your experience with them?
I mean, the equipment is coming down in cost. Well, this year is an anomaly. There's EV charging infrastructures having supply chains issues like everything else. But generally, the direction of the equipment is going down, which is great. But the other costs, labor, trenching, those are not. Those are just otherwise costs that are going to be incurred that really scale and volume don't impact. But what we are seeing is tremendous amount of incentive dollars that are more so in other markets. Maryland doesn't have a great incentive, but other markets are paying for between 60 to 80% of the cost of installing charging stations. You know, some of the New York, Massachusetts, I think New Jersey's starting to do that now. So we're seeing other states nearby starting to you know, recognize the importance of getting EV infrastructure in place, and recognizing that some of these added costs are just you know, the government needs to help take care of some of these costs to get more EV infrastructure in place. So I would say that's one thing to keep your eye out, is what is the state of Maryland going to do to help support these installations.
Okay. And I think I would add, for my own 2 cents to the end of that, is for folks thinking about whether or not they want to do EV or solar, one of the things to think about, even I think more so with EV, is that you know, as one of the things that drives the value of your units and the resale value of your units is you know, the demand to move into your building, and certainly adding EV stations is going to become an ever more important buying factor for folks looking to purchase units. So I would think about that and your options for financing those when you're thinking about where you might want to take a green project. And Matt, while we have you, a related question, or not a related question, sorry, a kind of practical question. How is maintenance affected with solar? You know, things like shoveling snow or other work on the premises. You know, just kind of you know, basic practical considerations from your point of view.
Well, I assume we're not talking about shoveling snow on rooftops. But you know, thankfully, snow tends to slide off of solar panels a little bit more than they do typical roof surface. That is something to keep in mind, though, for snow loads. And certainly there are, for the right for the right roof design, right, if it's right over a walkway or something like that, we do install snow guards like you would any sort of addition to a roof, to make sure that you don't get that the avalanche off your roof and put people's safety at risk. But for solar carports in a parking lot, yes, so we have carports, you know, in higher snow density areas like New York and Massachusetts and Connecticut, and yeah, you just need to make sure that generally your carports are, you know, 12 feet off the surface, easily identified, and yeah, the snow plows can generally work their way around the carports and the steel structures to allow the parking lots to get plowed as they normally would.
All right, great, thanks. Another question we had, which I think is probably one for me, do COCs need the same kind of association approval for purchase, whether financed or not, as they would for a PPA? And I would say that generally the answer is no. Those wind up being two very different approval requirements. So the PPA is almost like any other contract or service contract that you're going to enter into, and often the condo declarations will allow the board to do that, you know, either under a vote of itself or to delegate to a committee to do it. So your ability to get a PPA approved is going to be more of, well, it'll just be quicker and easier once you've decided to embark on that. A lot of times, if you're going to do a purchase option, that's going to trigger a full vote of the community, because it represents a significant capital purchase or entering into a significant debt instrument. So you'll have to check the individual condo declaration for your community, but normally that's going to be the big split, is that the PPA is basically a contract where you're getting some benefit out of it, and normally the board's empowered to enter into that. The purchase option is normally a capital decision that the condo declaration will designate as something that requires a full vote to enter into, because the you know, the financial instruments, the loan for that's going to be, you know, somewhere in the hundreds of thousands for the most part for an average size system. So you know, that's not something that the board is often empowered to enter into on its own without further approval. So that's another consideration to think about as you're entering into it. And also, you know, depending on what you think the support for it is, you know, you're more likely to get a solar project approved as a PPA structure than you are as a purchase structure. And that's just the reality of having to go to a larger approval body. Steve, I don't know if you've got any different experience in your opinion, but that's certainly been mine.
Yeah, no, that's definitely the experience we see as well. A PPA just tends to make, or at least tends to make, a lot of sense for a common ownership community, given that there's everything kind of wrapped into what the developer is doing. And that really includes what you're approving and what your obligations are behind it as well. So we do see a lot of considerations from boards to try and inform associations, make sure they understand what the solar project is, have presentations, but it's not the same kind of quote unquote vote of approval as other capital expenditures that come above a certain threshold, because that would be laid out in a separate process in people's bylaws and that sort. So it's more of an informational process that we see with the PPAs as opposed to a formal approval like you would with a large capital expenditure.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say in my experience too, that the PPA process allows you to impanel essentially a group of experts to consider it, and rely on their expertise to do it, which is I think more efficient and just easier on everybody's workload to get the project off the ground. Whereas if you put it to a full vote, you really got to educate the entire group, because they're making a decision on whether or not they're going to burden the community with a long-term debt obligation. And that tends to take a lot more of a heavier outreach and education effort, which is perfectly fine if that's what you want to do. You just have to understand that it's a greater lift on your part. Okay. I think that is all the questions we have for now, unless there's anything else that Steve and Matt want to add here, or anything that we didn't touch upon that you think we would want to pass on in this presentation.
Not for me, just, thanks again for having me on the panel. It's great to talk about this subject. Like we mentioned, the Green Bank works a lot with common ownership communities, and there are quite a few in Montgomery County, and quite a few important considerations as boards and property managers are working through how do you deal with energy efficiency, how do you deal with renewables. So we're always out there and interested in answering questions, doing presentations, and helping where we can.
Yeah, I'll just add another plug for the Green Bank. Frankly, I mean, as someone who's been doing this a long time and working with a variety of different parties, working with a Green Bank like Montgomery County Green Bank, who just truly understands all the dynamics of these projects and all the risks and economics and the process in and out. It's great to have a financial partner like that as you're going through these transactions. So I'll gladly put a plug in to reach out to the Green Bank if you're considering any types of these projects.
I'll echo Matt and Steve's comments. And again, having had the opportunity to work with both of them on solar projects, I can say they were great experiences all around. And I would also add that Montgomery County is unique, within Maryland, which sometimes has difficulties with financial incentives for solar projects, and it's a great resource that you have there that you don't have in other locations in Maryland. And I'd encourage all of you to reach out to them and see if there's any projects that are right size for you, and they'll be happy to talk to you. And certainly if you have any questions about the agreements themselves, or want to talk to somebody about kind of how your community might embark on one of these, please feel free to reach out to us here at Whiteford Taylor. And just like to thank Steve and Matt and Rokas for their time.
Thank you.
And I believe that is all from us. So thank you all very much. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any other questions.
Okay. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you all.